I was invited, actually, and I've been making diagrams and timelines. That's the consistent thing in most of my work, um, is that it usually has kind of a left to right relationship with time. And so I've been making a few of those, and someone in your curatorial outreach group must have seen something, and some of them are on the internet. But also, I'm in the same gallery. I'm an artist, working artist, and my work isn't really made for the scientific communities. It's made through the public, and it finds its way out through galleries and art venues and things like that. And another artist was commissioned by Places and Spaces to do a diagram that Kathy Berner had in mind, which was a kind of a genealogy of science, showing kind of how an idea comes out. And he did this sort of brain thing, and he works for the same gallery, and she may have stumbled across my work at that time. So when they were sending out invitations to get more interest in people applying, and so I sent. So anyway, they reached me, so I responded, and the piece that I sent, which was this, I sent actually a couple of pieces, but this one, the ones that I sent were actually not made specifically for the Places and Spaces exhibit. They were things that I'd actually already done.
Okay.
And this one, and I believe the iteration that was happening there was, I think, number 7, and it was about libraries.
Right. Right. Visual interfaces.
So I just thought, well, this piece that I have right here was about a genre of fiction. So that was a pretty close fit, and I think that it appealed to them and to the judges or the curators enough that it was included. And this was based really on the fact that I would look for subjects to diagram or map, and ones that I think that other people might be interested in as well. And I think the first map I made was a kind of autobiographical. I mean, literally my autobiography, and that had some interest just by the fact that I was a human being and other people are human beings, so they can relate to the ideas. But very often I find that I go at specific subjects, and it taps into people who have an abiding interest in that idea, right? And most of my things originally started. The initial ideas I worked with were art related, because I was showing in art centers, and art people had that in common. But then I just let some of my more eccentric interests draw me into other directions, and science fiction has been an interest of mine since I was a kid.
Okay.
So, and I'm a reader, and so I had I had this idea of doing something that had a kind of a bio form in science fiction, just because of the monsters and things like that. So this diagram, it doesn't follow the strict Cartesian grid of the left-right XY axis. It sort of swirls through it. So it was that was my sort of creative notion, is to bump out, and so that the tentacles of this sort of monster become kind of channels back into time, and so it was a matter of just doing research, and getting most of the things that other people have written. But the interesting thing about science fiction is that there's no shortage of opinions, and they're easily accessible, and people tend to do things like, here's 100 best books, and a group will publish, and there's a lot of competing ideas. So in this thing, I didn't want it to be, the research has just sort of a general, there's no real scientific method to it, but it was still a kind of a polling of what I could find, So I read a couple of authoritative histories, but also I wanted to have specific titles and names, and I did want to have the 100 best books. And so I found more and more that this was pretty easy. I could find at least 4 or 5 different authoritative groups, or people who at least claimed to have an opinion, and just sort of put it together in a big database, and then take the top, ones that I could fit. And so eventually, you have the earlier people talk about like the beginnings of science fiction. It actually doesn't really start until you have science. You can't have science fiction, they have science. But there are things that are related to science fiction that go way back to mythology and fantastic stories, and we've always had those things. So I started creating through my own, I started connecting those back, picking the ones that I thought were most important. You know, like there's the story of the Golem, which is in the Bible, or I'm not sure it's actually in the Bible, but it comes from Judaic storytelling, and it's this kind of almost like a Frankenstein monster, except for that it's different. But it's there, and so that's a kind of a prefiguring of Frankenstein, and Frankenstein is important because it's considered by experts to be the first science fiction novel. And you know, so I can go into more details about this. I'll just briefly mention it. The idea of science fiction, or even all genre fictions, which are the things that most people think of as like paperback books and things that people like to read, come out of a storytelling tradition that's fairly recent. It's Gothic fiction, which is, you know, these exciting stories that have this arc of intrigue and maybe some violence or some. There's a kind of they have a kind of a problem that they solve, and there's kind of a resolution in some kind of way, and it's really 200 years old. The whole tradition. Prior to that, stories didn't have that same kind of satisfying arc of the storyteller that we expect that movies are based on, and most paperback novels and things like that. And the genres of fiction hadn't been settled. They were kind of found during the 19th century, and that would be coming out of the Gothic age, and these were things like Dracula was a story. It was an early Gothic novel, and they were connected to, you know, Shelley. Frankenstein was written by Harriet Shelley, and her husband was a romantic poet, and in fact the Gothic tradition kind of comes out of the feelings of the Romantic movement. So this kind of gives kind of a genealogy where you trace it back and you begin to see the roots that is actually connected into deeper aspects of our culture. And so the idea of these tentacles are there a little bit like roots, and they pass through this cloud of science, and they go back into things like mythology, and what people like Campbell will say is the kind of the sources of mythology, which is this kind of wonderment about the world and fear, apprehension about the world, and so that's what these things go back. And then as they come through, and we develop these the kind of industrial and middle class and leisure time and things like that, where fiction has a place in people's lives. Science fiction kind of blooms out, and other forms of fiction like westerns and detective stories and horror stories have also formed at that time. Romantic novels, and they kind of, in this thing, they go off into a different, because this is really about science fiction. And then we just march through the various periods of time, and that's pretty well documented. You know, that's most science fiction people, you know, know about Jules Verne, and then the pulps and H.G. Wells, and then the magazines that come out, Campbell and Hugo and Gernsback, and eventually people like Asimov, and Asimov actually had a chart like this where you don't have to have a kind of a real strict methodology like a science fiction. You need to keep your apples in order, and you can't toss in any oranges. But a diagram like mine, which is more like telling a story, I throw in something, so this random things, and so you have stuff like Asimov, who is very analytical. He's kind of a scientist himself. At least wrote scientific journalist stuff. He divided science fiction into periods of what they were interested in, what they were actually trying to do. Starting off with the sort of rockets and ray guns thing, which is what most people immediately think of as science fiction, which goes towards the Buck Rogers idea, right? But really, pretty soon, that was really kind of an adventure storytelling, and it really much more like the Gothic novels. But science fiction moves into this investigation of possible things that comes out of seriously trying to put what we know about science and what we, you know, and storytelling, and then what was coming down the road, and so it becomes speculative in that kind of way, and so that they go through the science dominant period, which would be from the mid 30s to the 50s, and then you go into this period of psychology and sociology. This would be like the period of a Twilight Zone and things like that, where it's not rockets and ray guns anymore. It's kind of weird, kind of changes in humans that have come into our awareness because of the science that we have, as opposed to the science reflecting off of the planets. And then you move into a period of time where it's really more about the literary forms, about how people write, which is like the 60s. You have different kinds of writers, and then they restart this sort of hard science fiction stuff, and that's kind of, got where we are over the period of time now. You've got the branching genres, cyberpunk, steampunk,
right,
things like that. The sort of base of the soup happens on a level of not a kind of methodical thinking, but just sort of like letting things come in and cook on that kind of back burner where you don't really know what's going on. But as the ideas begin to be clarified, I start using large pieces of paper and making sketches of the ideas. And I might go into it with the idea of like, wow, I really ought to do something with this that's different than the last thing I did, because they're all getting kind of boring, looking the same. So let me make something based on a monster or a different. I wanted to have a morphology. I've done a few pieces where I use some kind of body form or something drawn that becomes a metaphor. So, the earliest diagrams that are of this kind are from using a tree. It's like a family tree diagram starting quite some time ago with they made a genealogical tree for Jesus that would connect King David to Mary, and but the idea was that you have a tree, and a tree is a form that everybody understands. This branching, we know it has a root, and it goes somewhere. So you're using this as kind of a metaphor for the movement of time and the inheritance, connectivity. Where something comes out of another. That's really the idea. And a tree, the branch comes out of the trunk, comes out of the root, comes out of the earth. So this is a good metaphor for inheritance, for evolution, for the progress of an idea. So that was the idea, is that if you have that metaphorical form, it becomes an organizing principle that conveys a lot of information that people already know to help them understand what you're trying to tell them. Right? That's the idea, is that you use something that you need. You can't start from scratch. You need to use things that people already understand in order to tell them things that they don't already know. And so I'll look for some helpful metaphor or style or connecting and putting together two ideas. In this case, it makes use of the kind of the octopus squid kind of thing as having some relationship to branches and trees, and I don't think that people probably ever thought of a squid as being something that would convey a sense of time, but they're making the connection when they see this with trees and roots, I think, or conduits at least, things moving through. Some people think a lot of mine look like intestines and stuff like that, but what it still means is this kind of tube that's like a conduit for something. And so our thinking about time is very much like something moving through space. There's no real, it's just because we can't think of time in any other way that fits into a two-dimensional image. It moves along, maybe from the bouncing ball on the screen, but anyway, so wherever it came from, I don't know, but it's still well understood, so people can, and that's the beginning of telling a story, and that's my job. That's if you were gonna say, if you wanted me to say the thing that I try to do the most, the thing that I try to not lose sight of, is that I'm telling a story with these things. That I want you to come away with an understanding of what I said, and I am more interested in that you get it than in that it's a perfect storytelling, that it has to be compelling, has to draw you in and leave you with an understanding. I don't believe that there, when you move from one media to the next, or you just thought and thinking and understanding, you're always losing something. So the point is that I want to make my choices based on a communicative idea rather than for instance, science. It's important to keep the data clean, and to not put anything in there or throw anything away that'll corrupt the tracing back of so that there's the methodology has to be repeatable and clean, whereby mine has to be compelling and informative, and understandable. So this difference, and so a lot of the places, spaces, diagrams use a different set of standards than I do, and that's because they come out of a more rigorous, or let's just say a different rigorous discipline, where the methodology can't be corrupted, and storytelling corruption can work in your favor. I mean, as long as you because what you're following is not connected directly to the world. It's connected to the understandings. Like that's the ultimate judgment is based on, does it work in people's minds, not is it an accurate reflection of as something is on the ground. So it's just a bit different. I mean, we hope they would all line up in the long run, but in fact, none of them actually line up. That's just the job of science and storytellers, is to try and get it so that we're better lined up. But in the end,